5:03 a.m. Japan Standard Time. The Senkaku Islands are 8 uninhabited outcroppings of rock and scrub in the East China Sea. The largest, barely 4 square kilometers, administered by Japan and claimed by the People's Republic of China. They sit at the southern end of the Ryukyu Island chain, 170 kilometers northeast of the northern tip of Taiwan, 330 kilometers west of Okinawa. Their strategic value is not their size. Their strategic value is their location. They sit at the junction of the first island chain's most tactically significant choke point, the waterway through which planned naval forces must transit to reach the open Pacific from their East Sea Fleet bases. Whoever controls the Senkakus controls the observation and monitoring of that transit. The People's Liberation Army had assessed this for 23 years. At 5:03 a.m., the plan's East Sea Fleet activated a coordinated operation that had been rehearsed 7 times in the preceding 18 months under exercise designations that Japanese and U.S. intelligence had cataloged, assessed, and briefed to the alliance's senior leadership with increasing urgency. The rehearsals had been classified as exercises. The activation at 5:03 a.m. was not classified as an exercise by anyone who was watching it develop on their tactical displays. 11 Type 071 amphibious transport dock vessels and 4 Type 075 landing helicopter dock ships, a total amphibious lift capacity sufficient to carry 2 reinforced Marine brigades, had been positioned 140 kilometers northwest of the Senkakus over the preceding 48 hours under the cover of a combined arms exercise designation that had initially been assessed as consistent with previous rehearsal patterns. The assessment had shifted to probable operational intent 18 hours earlier when the amphibious group's course change brought it onto a direct approach bearing for the Senkaku Islands rather than the exercise operating area north of the Zhoushan archipelago. The Japan Air Self-Defense Force had elevated its readiness posture at 11 p.m. The U.S. Forces Japan had elevated to maximum readiness at 1:30 a.m. Neither elevation had produced a visible defensive posture that would give the plan political justification to characterize its own operation as a response. The operation activated simultaneously across 3 domains. From planned surface combatants forming a defensive screen 80 kilometers northwest of the amphibious group, 6 Type 052D destroyers and 2 Type 055 cruisers, 41 DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles lifted from mobile launchers in Fujian Province on trajectories toward 2 targets. The U.S. Carrier Strike Group operating 220 kilometers east of the Senkakus in the Philippine Sea, and the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force Destroyer Squadron operating 90 kilometers north of the Senkakus. The DF-21D salvo was designed not to sink these forces but to compel them into defensive engagement that would consume their SM-3 and SM-6 inventories before the amphibious group reached the landing beaches. From J-20 stealth fighter wings at Longtian and Shantou air bases, 48 J-20 aircraft launched in 2 waves on air superiority missions tasked with establishing a no-fly corridor over the Senkakus and the 150-kilometer approach envelope. Their target was not the U.S. carrier air wing. The J-20's engagement parameters were calibrated against the F-35 and the JASDF's F-35A and F-15J squadrons that would contest control of the airspace above the landing beaches. Without air superiority over the beaches, the amphibious landing was operationally untenable. And from pre-positioned planned Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels that had been holding station within 12 kilometers of the Senkakus for 6 days under the cover of a fisheries dispute. Vessels that had been classified as civilian by Japanese authorities because their weapons were concealed below deck and they carried no military registry. 36 PJ-12 heavy machine gun platforms and 4 Type 056 corvettes that had been operating under civilian vessel identifiers activated simultaneously and began landing operations on the 2 largest islands using rigid-hull inflatable craft that had been staging from the corvette's stern ramps since 4:45 a.m. The initial landing force on Uotsuri Island was 340 personnel. On Kuba Island, 180 personnel. They were on the ground before a single Japanese or American weapon had been released. The ground presence on the islands was the political and military center of gravity of the entire operation. Every planned weapon in the air and on the water was designed to protect those 520 personnel long enough for them to reach defensible terrain and establish a communications link declaring Chinese administrative control. Once that declaration was made from soil that Chinese personnel physically occupied, the political cost of dislodging them by force entered a calculation that the plan's strategic planners had assessed as prohibitive for Japan acting alone and deeply uncomfortable for a U.S. government that would face the optics of kinetically removing a landing force from islands whose sovereignty was disputed. The Japanese and U.S. response had been rehearsed for exactly this scenario under the JMSD FUSFJ Combined Defense Planning Framework. The rehearsal had a name. It had a pre-authorized response architecture. It had been briefed to the Prime Minister of Japan and the U.S. Secretary of Defense 6 months earlier. The political authorization for the response had been pre-delegated to USFJ and JMSDF operational commanders for defensive engagement within Japanese-administered territory. The Senkaku Islands were Japanese-administered territory. The JMSDF destroyer squadron, north of the Senkakus, had been tracking the approaching amphibious group since 2 a.m. Its commanding officer had requested and received engagement pre-authorization at 3:30 a.m., 90 minutes before the operation activated. At 5:03 a.m., when the DF-21D launch signatures appeared on his display, his ships were already in their assigned engagement geometry. The space-based infrared system detected the DF-21D launches at 5:03 a.m. The alert reached the carrier's Tactical Flag Command Center and the JMSDF command ship simultaneously at 5:03 a.m. and 28 seconds. The Joint Air and Missile Defense Network, which linked U.S. Aegis platforms, JMSDF Aegis-equipped destroyers, the JASDF's ground-based air defense batteries, and the JMSDF's own SM-3 Block 2A equipped Congo-class destroyers through a combined CEC architecture that had been in joint operational testing for 4 years, began its engagement sequence at 5:04 a.m. 21 of the 41 DF-21D tracks were assigned to U.S. Aegis platforms. The carrier group's screening destroyers and cruiser, firing SM-3 Block 2A from their current positions in the Philippine Sea. 20 were assigned to JMSDF Aegis destroyers. One track, assessed as targeting the flagship of the JMSDF squadron at the most compressed engagement geometry, was assigned simultaneously to both a USSM-3 and a JMSDF SM-3. A double assignment that the joint CEC architecture had been specifically programmed to execute against high-priority ballistic tracks. 37 of the 41 DF-21D tracks were intercepted in mid-course and early terminal phase between 5:09 a.m. and 5:14 a.m. 3 executed terminal maneuvering that degraded the intercept geometry. Each required a second layer SM-6 engagement, 2 of which were successful. The third SM-6 engagement achieved proximity detonation parameters but off-axis, insufficient for structural defeat. The DF-21D continued into its terminal descent. The JMSDF destroyer it was targeting had maneuvered 6 nautical miles from its position at the time of the DF-21D's final targeting update. Not enough to take it outside the warhead's lethal radius, but enough to change the engagement geometry for the second SM-6 release that the U.S. cruiser fired from a different bearing. That intercept was confirmed at 7,400 meters altitude, 28 nautical miles from the destroyer. One DF-21D reached the terminal engagement envelope against the carrier group's outer screening destroyer. Its maneuvering bus had executed a 3-second lateral deflection at low altitude that the Aegis engagement algorithm had not been able to compensate for in the available engagement window. SM-6 missed. CIWS engaged at 1.4 kilometers. The burst connected with the warhead section at 900 meters. The structural defeat was partial. The guidance system was severed, but the warhead body maintained sufficient integrity for a partial detonation on water impact 140 meters off the destroyer's port beam. The blast and fragment pattern from the partial detonation struck the destroyer's port side. Significant fragment damage to the port sensor array and one missile canister. The ship's crew reported 12 personnel injuries. 7 minor, 4 moderate, 1 serious. The one seriously injured crew member was in surgery within 40 minutes of impact. The ship remained combat-capable at reduced sensor function. 1 destroyer hit. The rest of the DF-21D salvo addressed. The air engagement over the Senkakus was structurally different from any air battle in the preceding scenarios of this framework because both sides were operating with low observable aircraft. The J-20 against the F-35A and the JASDF's F-35J. The standard radar-based air picture that Aegis and AWACS platforms provided to the intercept force was degraded for both sides. Each party knew the other was there. Neither could reliably track the other at the ranges that beyond visual range engagement doctrine was built upon. The E-2D Hawkeye from the carrier was the critical asymmetry. Its AN/APY-9 radar had been specifically engineered for the low observable detection problem. Its processing architecture had been designed to pull low RCS targets from the background noise that defeated conventional airborne radar. It could not provide precise fire control quality tracks on the J-20. It could provide sufficient track quality to cue the F-35C's own active electronically scanned array radar to a search sector where the J-20 was operating, reducing the F-35C's own detection problem from 360 degrees to a 40-degree arc. In that 40-degree arc, at the engagement ranges imposed by low observable mutual detection, the F-35C's passive sensor fusion gave it an advantage it would not have had against a non-stealthy adversary in the same airspace. 48 J-20S against a combined defensive force of 36 F-35. A's from the carrier air wing and JASDF squadrons at Naha and Kadena, plus 12 F-15Js from the 201st Hikotai operating at maximum combat radius from Chitose. The air engagement ran from 5:07 a.m. to 5:41 a.m. 34 minutes of sustained multi-aircraft combat over and around the Senkakus that was the largest manned fighter engagement since the Gulf War. The engagement unfolded in 3 phases that compressed into one continuous action. The outer merge at beyond visual range, where the E-2D's queuing advantage allowed the F-35C to fire first in 17 separate engagement pairs. A mid-range phase where the J-20's thrust vector capability and its IRST passive sensor reduced the F-35's first detection advantage to near parity. And a close-range phase over the islands themselves where the F-15J's kinematic performance at lower altitude offset its radar cross-section disadvantage. The 3 phases were not sequential. They were simultaneous across different altitude bands and geographic sectors of a 150-kilometer airspace. It was not decided by any single action. It was decided by attrition at margins that the pre-mission analysis had assessed as favorable to the combined US-Japan force because the F-35C and F-35A's sensor fusion advantage in the low observable environment was measurable in the time to first detection metric, and time to first detection determined who fired first. In low observable air combat, who fired first was who survived. 31 J-20S were engaged, and their pilots were assessed as having been forced to disengage or were assessed as non-operational by 5:41 a.m. 17 completed their engagements and were withdrawing toward the mainland. 6 F-35As and 2 F-15Js from the combined defensive force were assessed as non-operational by end of engagement. 8 pilots had ejected. 6 over water where the JMSDF rescue operation activated immediately. 2 had ejected over the Senkaku Islands themselves, where they were recovered by JMSDF, Special Operations Forces that had been inserted by helicopter at 5:31 a.m. under cover of the air engagement. All 8 pilots were accounted for within 90 minutes of ejection. 1 pilot had sustained significant injuries on water impact. 7 were assessed as flight status with medical evaluation. The air picture over the Senkakus at 5:41 a.m. 17 surviving J-20S in withdrawal. The combined US-Japan force holding the airspace. The amphibious group was still 60 kilometers northwest, its approach speed unchanged. Its timeline to the landing beach now approximately 90 minutes. The 520 plan personnel on Uotsuri and Kuba Islands were the operational problem that the air and missile defense architecture had been protecting the forces needed to address. They had landed carrying man-portable air defense systems, crew-served heavy machine guns, and anti-armor weapons. A defensive loadout consistent with holding terrain rather than projecting force. They were not there to fight outward. They were there to occupy, communicate, and survive long enough for the political dimension of their presence to precede any military response to it. As long as they were on the ground, the political dimension of the operation was active. Dislodging them required either a direct counter-landing, a JGSDF amphibious operation against defended terrain, or a precision engagement of the concealed positions they had established in the island's terrain, which required positive identification of military personnel in contested sovereignty territory and rules of engagement authorization that the Japanese government had prepared and issued to JGSDF commanders at 4 a.m. The precision engagement authorization was specific. Military personnel in hostile posture on Japanese-administered territory could be engaged by precision munitions if they were actively preparing to engage or engaging Japanese or Allied forces. The 520 plan personnel on the islands had positioned crew-served weapons in the karst terrain above the landing beaches and had activated encrypted communications. Both criteria were met. JGSDF Apaches, operating from the helicopter carrier JS Izumo, which had been positioned 40 kilometers east of the Senkakus since 3 a.m., engaged the identified crew-served weapon positions on Uotsuri at 5:48 a.m. using precision anti-armor missiles and 30mm cannon fire from standoff range. The engagement was methodical and targeted, not suppressive fire, but precise identification then engagement of specific positions. The JS Izumo's F-35Bs provided overhead sensor coverage that allowed the Apaches to engage positions in terrain that their own sensors could not directly observe. By 6:14 a.m., the crew-served weapon positions on both islands had been engaged and were assessed as non-functional. The planned landing force had withdrawn to interior terrain positions and had ceased active weapons employment. Their communications link with the amphibious group remained active. The planned amphibious group, now 45 kilometers from the Senkakus, received a direct communication from the U.S. 7th Fleet at 6:09 a.m. through the established emergency communications channel. The Senkaku Islands were Japanese-administered territory. The landing force was engaged in a hostile act against Japanese sovereign administration, and any further approach by the amphibious group would be treated as an act of armed aggression. The communication was simultaneously transmitted to the Plan Eastern Theater Command. The Plan Surface Combatant Screen had been tracking the U.S. and JMSDF forces throughout the engagement. Its J-20 air cover had been degraded to 17 airframes in withdrawal. Its DF-21D salvo had been absorbed by the Joint Defense Architecture at a cost of 1 damaged U.S. destroyer and 12 personnel injuries. Its landing force was in interior terrain on the islands, no longer able to employ its weapons. The Plan Amphibious Group began a course change at 6:17 a.m. Not a reversal, a reduction in speed and a shift to a holding course that maintained its current position without continuing the approach. The course change was not a withdrawal announcement. It was a military communication through movement that both parties understood without requiring verbal confirmation. The 520 Plan personnel on the Senkakus were still on the islands. They had not been dislodged. Their weapons positions had been neutralized. Their communications remained active. The political dimension of the operation, the physical presence on Japanese-administered territory, was intact. What was not intact was the military infrastructure that had been designed to protect their presence long enough for it to become a political reality. The amphibious group that was supposed to reinforce them was holding 45 kilometers northwest. The air superiority that was supposed to deny Japanese and U.S. intervention was in withdrawal. The DF-21D salvo that was supposed to hold the carrier and the JMSDF destroyer squadron at range had produced 1 damaged ship and 12 injuries, rather than the contested sea control that the operational plan required. The JGSDF counter-landing force, 2 companies of the Japan Amphibious Rapid Deployment Brigade, embarked on JS Izumo and the transport vessel JS Kunisaki, began its approach to the Senkakus at 6:22 a.m. under the air cover of the F-35Bs and the remaining F-35As. The counter-landing would take approximately 4 hours to complete once the approach began. The terrain had to be cleared systematically. The 520 Plan personnel, now without crew-served weapons but still armed and in defensible positions, represented a situation that both governments were simultaneously trying to resolve at the command level while their forces were converging at the operational level. At 6:31 a.m., the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs transmitted a formal communication to the Japanese government through the emergency diplomatic channel. The communication characterized the plan personnel on the islands as maritime law enforcement personnel conducting a legitimate inspection of Chinese sovereign territory. The Japanese government's response, transmitted at 6:34 a.m., characterized them as military personnel engaged in a hostile seizure of Japanese-administered territory and stated that dislodgement operations were proceeding under Japan's right of self-defense. The counter-landing would proceed. The diplomatic communications would continue in parallel. Both parties understood that the outcome of the counter-landing would establish the facts on the ground that the subsequent diplomatic process would have to address. Facts on the ground were being created at 6:35 a.m. by people with weapons moving toward other people with weapons on a 4-square-kilometer island in the East China Sea. Time from first plan activation to end of initial air and missile engagement, 98 minutes. Plan weapons employed: 41 DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles from Fujian Province, 48 J-20 sorties in air superiority role, maritime militia and corvette landing force, 520 personnel on Uotsuri and Kuba Islands. Ballistic intercept rate, 97.6%. 40 of 41 intercepted or structurally defeated. 1 partial detonation at 140 meters from destroyer, 12 personnel injuries, ship combat capable at reduced function. Air engagement result, 31 of 48 J-20S assessed non-operational or disengaged. 8 US and JGSDF aircraft assessed non-operational. 8 pilots accounted for, all recovered. Landing force status: 520 personnel on islands, crew-served weapon positions neutralized by JGSDF Apache engagement. Plan amphibious group holding at 45 kilometers, course change at 6:17 a.m. U.S. assets: 1 destroyer with partial detonation fragment damage, combat capable. 12 personnel injuries, 1 serious. 6 F-35 as non-operational. 5 pilots recovered, 1 in medical care. SM-3 and SM-6. Ready loads significantly reduced across combined force. JMSDF and JASDF. 2 F-15Js and 3 F-35 as non-operational. 2 JASDF pilots recovered from Senkaku terrain. SM-3 ready load on Congo-class destroyers at 41%. The joint US-Japan defense architecture had absorbed the largest coordinated planned military operation since 1949 and had maintained the operational conditions required to support a counter-landing. The plan had positioned 520 personnel on Japanese-administered territory and had been unable to protect their position with the military force it had generated. The counter-landing was proceeding. The political process was beginning. The outcome of both was undetermined at 6:35 a.m. It would be determined in the hours that followed by factors that extended well beyond the engagement architecture that had performed as designed for the preceding 98 minutes.